You are live. So, hi Bruno. Today we will speak about ecology in the socialist countries. So, Professor Bruno, let's talk.
Yes, so what is very important, I will begin with that, is that World Wildlife Fund, which cannot be considered as a leftist organization, not to talk about communist, considers, and behind this organization, the United Nations, considered that the most ecological country in the world is Cuba, and that the second most ecological country in the world is China. Cuba, because because its whole policy, agricultural policy, and China because they planted in the last 10 years the equivalent of in forest as the whole part of Brazilian Amazonia was burned. So China did rebuild what the Brazilian capitalists destroyed in their country. And that's one very important information for nowadays. And if we look back to the 20th century, the country which was the most ecological is the Soviet Union before Khrushchev times, especially for its policy launched in 1948, the so-called in Soviet Union agroforestry program that was carried on between 1948 and 1952. And of course, this policy of Soviet Union was the result of a very profound study about what they called forest studies that was carried on in Soviet Union in the 20s and 30s. That was, of course, interrupted during World War, and that was taken back at the end of the 40s. And what's changed in Soviet Union, it is the Khrushchev time, because when Khrushchev arrived to power, he changed fundamentally the policy of the agricultural and ecological policies in Soviet Union, telling that after all, the American way of modernization of agriculture is the good way, and that Soviet Union, in its catch-up strategy with Western countries and especially with United States, must take into account the successes of so-called successes of agriculture, of American agriculture, with a lot of chemistry and with a lot of specialization, not taking into account what was taken into account earlier in Soviet Union, the different qualities of earth and and consequently the necessity to plant what is linked with the quality of each soil. So what I'm telling you is very important, because it shows that the pre-Khrushchev Soviet Union and then Cuba and then China were from the very beginning very aware of the environmental question, and that soil is something vivid that cannot be exploited to have short-term results, and that the real scientific planning must look for long-term results. So if we make the analysis of real socialism, of what we call real socialism in the 20th century and in the 21st century, we see that basically socialism is ecological, and when it is not ecological, it is at the moment when Soviet or socialist leaders are obsessed or fascinated by the Western and especially the American way of production, and it's very, very important, because we even have notes, footnotes of Stalin, who is reading different Soviet scientists about agriculture. And in this footnote that personally Stalin react to what he's reading, we see that he is very aware of what we would today call ecological planning, ecological socialism, and ecological approach. And this is, of course, completely forget now because of the anti-communist propaganda, of course, but also because communists, after 1956, all over the world, and not only in Soviet Union, did forget about that. Even Cuba, when we look at Cuban history of ecology, Cuba was in the 60s very ecologically oriented, and it's changed under what we can say of Soviet pressures. And in the 70s, Cuban agriculture began to be less and less ecological and more chemical. And after the collapse of Soviet Union, Cubans went back to their first, let's say, tradition, and realized a complete, balanced ecological agriculture. But in the same time, after all what I told, there is also something that we must take into account, is that we have two types of ecology. We have reactionary ecology and we have progressive ecology. Progressive ecology is based on Marxism, and Marx was also aware of environmental questions and issues, but he was also aware that humankind was fighting against nature. Nature is not a god. Nature is not perfect. The law of nature can be very reactionary, very negative, and very violent. So we have to be aware that nature is not something that has to be celebrated as if it was a new religion. And so there is a dialectical process between the issue to take into account environmental question without something like a religious belief. And there is also another ecology, the reactionary ecology, the ecology that was at the base, and we have to take that into account. The Green Movement in Germany after the Second World War, its roots come not from the left, but from the right, and even from the extreme right. Quite a lot of Nazi or former Nazi began ecologists after the Second World War, but on a completely another ground than the ecology I was talking about earlier, because the right-wing ecology is an ecology which is creating something like a religion of nature. Nature is always right, and human beings are bad. And that's the base of the reactionary philosophy, which directed humankind towards fascism, and which directed also humankind toward the so-called left ecology, which is the bourgeois ecology, I would rather say, that began to be in the mood during the, let's say, postmodern era from the late 70s, 80s, and so on. And there is a basic difference between the ecology, which sees that the basic contradiction is between capital and nature, and the reactionary ecology, which sees that the basic contradiction is between the technical process and the so-called human being, because the first one is optimistic. It means that human beings can take into account the rule of nature, so to make humankind progress. And the pessimistic view, the reactionary one, is just telling that human beings are bad, morally bad people that are destroying the goddess of nature. Of course, this point of view is not now so religious as it was, but in fact, it's religious. It means that there is no future for humankind. There is no hope for humankind. And nature is always right, and nature is not always right. Nature is the base from which humankind develop. Human beings have to take control of nature in a balanced way, in a really scientific way, but without any form of religious cult. Nature is not good, and technical progress is not bad. The technical progress begins to be bad when there is reactionary policies, when there is capitalistic policies. But as we saw in Soviet Union before 1956, in Cuba or in China, and maybe in other countries, I didn't look for policies in Korea or Vietnam or other countries. I'm just talking about the countries I just checked. We see that the fact that capital is not existing as a private capital or is under control makes ecology much more successful than in Western countries, where in fact ecologists are just playing about moral question, about, let's say, developing the culpability, the sin, the feeling of sinfulness, but not on a scientific base, but rather on a purely so-called moral left. So I would say that the nowadays ecology, which is carried on by most capitalist countries, but which is also carried on by a lot of so-called green left movements, is reactionary. Basically, it's a reactionary, I would say, a reactionary kidnapping of the ecology, which can be a science promoting human progress and creating a balanced relation between man, humankind, and nature. And that's what means for me what is important. And there are quite a lot of books and studies that have been carried on this subject, but they are not very well known outside, let's say, specialists, or they are not very well known outside, I would say, very limited circles within Marxism, because the problem now is that quite a lot of Marxism or Marxists are now, let's say, depressed by the end of the Soviet bloc, of the Soviet and the real socialist camp, and in fact they accepted the so-called alternative left discourse, which is basically a right-wing discourse. And that has to be said. The green movement is maybe sympathetic for different aspects, but basically the green movement is a reactionary movement. And not only in ecology, we can now observe that the so-called left green movement, anti-militaristic, pro-peace movement from the 60s and 70s turned out now to be one of the most aggressive movement. I mean, quite a lot of green leaders, and especially German green leaders, took very active role in NATO wars. So they like little flowers and little animals, but they bomb Yugoslavia without any discussion, and they like to bomb with uranium, Yugoslavia, Iraq, and so on. And they have nothing against that type of pollution, which is, of course, much more dangerous for flowers, but also for human beings, than the pollution they are supposed to fight against. So we have to understand that quite a lot of the ecological movement is just hypocrisy, which was invented to make people feel guilty and to develop something Hitler based on. It means the cult of nature, because the cult of nature is the cult of the strongest. Hitler was an ecologist in a certain way, but he was an ecologist taking the side of the lion against the antelope. He was an ecologist taking the side of the wolf and not of the little animals. And in the human, and it's the most important, in human society, he was taken the side of the Aryans against the Semites and the Semitic and the Jews, because of course they were supposed to be more healthy, stronger, more natural, and that type of ecology is the same type of ecology, of course, in a less caricatural way. We observe now, because what we are observing now is that the poorest country have no right to develop because they are polluting. But of course, the rich country, they have to have the same economical level, except for the popular classes, because people, lower classes, have to feel guilty because they pollute. But the big bourgeoisie has not to feel guilty. I would say it's in a very caricatural way. The worker have to go to work cycling and not taking cars, but big green leaders go to international conference by plane, which are polluting about 100 times or even 1,000 times more than the car the worker is taking to go to his work. Of course, what I'm telling now is something caricatural to a certain extent, but I think it's very important. And these questions, this issue, were already analyzed by Lenin and Stalin and a lot of Soviet biologists in the 20s, in the 30s, and in the 40s. And later they were analyzed in Cuba by biologists and environmentalists up to date. So we have to be aware of that the Marxists, the communists, have not to feel guilt about what they did. Of course, in Soviet Union, we all heard that part of the Soviet Union were destroyed by chemicals. We heard about the Aral Sea disappearing. But we never ask why this happened. It didn't happen at the Stalin time. It happened after the Khrushchev, after Khrushchev took power and decided that there should be grain production carried on along American model, and that there should be cotton production in Uzbekistan made on the base of American way of developing agriculture. So in fact, we can say that it's because of American way of life that the RLC disappeared. It's not because of Soviet socialism. It's because of the betraying of Soviet socialism after the Khrushchev took power. Even if in the 70s there was some correction in Soviet Union, it means that the environmental question was not so extremely carried on like at the Khrushchev times. But anyway, the idea that the chemical, let's say chemical agricultural model taken from the United States was never abandoned after 1956. Before 1956, we have to take into account, I told earlier about the so-called program of 1948, 1952, which is purely, of course, this word didn't exist at that time, but in fact, when we are reading now all the literature about what is called permaculture, it is already written in Soviet Union in the 40s. In the 40s, Soviet planners were taking into account the fact that the soil is something vivid. So if you put too much chemicals in the soil, you destroy the soil. Soil is something vivid, like all nature, and the result of that was that the plan was for agriculture in Soviet Union was planning that you have to change production in a rotation movement, so the soil will not produce all the time the same thing, so the soil will regenerate. The other things is that they decided in about 1 million 1 million kilometers, quadrat kilometers of Soviet Union, so let's say 1/20 of Soviet Union, to develop what they called the forest walls. And every kolkhoz or sovkhoz had to be circled by forest. So this forest will feed the land and make the production grow for long term and not for short term. And this plan was introduced up to the Khrushchev time, when Khrushchev decided that this type of forests are useless. We have also to take into account that Soviet Union created the most developed in the world nature reserves, which are called zapoviedniki. And it was created in the 30s and 50s. And this worked so well that even now, if you have the classification of the natural reserve in the world, Russia is still the first country in the world to have the best natural reserve in the world, where the experimentation of what is nature, what is land, what is forest, is the most advanced up till now. And this is quite important. And you had a lot of Soviet scientists who developed those questions, who worked about those questions. And it's not, it's very funny to discover that the Soviet scientists who were later criticized in a very caricatural way were the ones that had more or less the more ecological way of thinking. I'm talking about especially three names, Michurin, Lysenko, and Williams. Lysenko is, of course, now the symbol of the so-called Stalin tyranny. But if we look at his thesis on agriculture, it is exactly the thesis that are now coming back in the science. But of course, nobody will say that it comes from Lysenko. But it was what is now becoming very clever, let's say, in the so-called ecological circles, is an argumentation that was developed by Lysenko in the 40s and 50s. I don't want to say that Lysenko didn't make any thought and he was always right. Of course, I'm not a scientist and I don't take part in this debate because it's not my level. But anyway, what I can say is that at least some parts of what Lysenko discovered has been proved now at the beginning of the 21st century as something really important. There is also somebody which is very interesting on the symbolical point of view. A Soviet scientist who died in 1946, which is called Williams. Who is called Williams, excuse me. And it's very interesting because you say, Williams, a Soviet scientist, what's that? In fact, he is the son of an American black who immigrated in Soviet Union and who married a Soviet woman. And of course, his son has the American name Williams, and he was one of the leader of the scientists who developed these theories about environmental balance within socialist planning. And for me, it's very symbolical. I mean, the son of an American black immigrating in Soviet Union that managed to be one of the leading scientists in Soviet Union. I mean, when we talk about internationalism, that's pure internationalism. That's realized in internationalism. It would have never been, at that time in the United States, black people were suffering segregation. And one black man emigrated to Soviet Union and his son become one of the greatest scientists in Soviet agriculture. You know, it's something. It's something that we have to remind people. I mean, because there is the scientific aspect of that, there is the let's say ecological aspect of that, but there is also the human aspect of that, which is very interesting, and it's important. I think for communists to remind people about such man like Williams, who made career in Soviet Union and who created the base of the ecology we are discovering back 50 years after 70 years after he is dead. And then we see how Soviet science was a vanguard science. All this, let's say, propaganda about backward Soviet Union, that could only copy Western technologies but had no innovation policies. And now it discovers that they were thinking, they were writing, they were experiencing things We are now discovering back 70 years after the end of Soviet Union, and especially 70 years after the, let's say, the Khrushchev victory within the Communist Party. And of course, this discussion about who is Stalin and what was that the Stalin time has to be carried on. But anyway, it shows, at least in the ecological field, that Stalin was very conscious of things that the West is now asking just now. The discussion, the scientific discussion Stalin had with Soviet scientists are discussions that were unimaginable in the Western countries at his time, and that are imaginable now. That's something very, very, very important also to remind about, because it makes the world looking very completely differently. And as I told earlier, Cuba is also very interesting on that field, because Cuba is a tiny country. We know the success of Cuban health system, but who knows that United Nations and World Wildlife Funds consider Cuba as the most advanced country in the ecological field. So there are a lot of things we have to fight for. I mean, just to remind people what is real, what is going on in the world, and I think that of course communists have to be self-critics, of course. But they have not to hide their successes. They have big successes they have to be proud of, and they have not to hide them. And in the ecological field, they were the vanguard of humankind in the first half of the 20th century, and they are still the vanguard of humankind in such countries like Cuba, and to a certain extent also China, comparing with capitalist countries. So I think that ecology, we have to carry on the class struggle, the world class struggle, also in the field of ecology, especially because Marxists were right on that field, and it's already scientifically proved, because the ecological literature now, they don't quote Michurin, they don't quote Williams, they don't quote Vernadsky, they don't quote Dokuchayev, they don't quote Stalin, they don't quote Castro, and so on and so on. But all these people thought about ecology. All those people wrote about ecology. All those people achieved something in the field of ecology. At the time, Western world was oriented toward something, another type of ecology, the fascist ecology. The fascist ecology, which is a romantic, let's say, ecology, but which is an anti-human, anti-progressive, reactionary ecology. And this ecology came out after the Second World War, creating all this, let's say, middle-class green movement, which is not very progressive, and which is, I would even say, basically reactionary. Yes, so I don't know, maybe you want to ask me some questions.
Yes. I think that you have to cut your... I'm listening. Okay, I want to add about this fascist ecology, that today we have the current in the imperialist movement ecologists, which said that all this, it is the problem of the surpopulation of the human. And when they said about surpopulation, they said about Africa and other countries like this. So they said, oh, you know, that we have to make something that the African families have less children, yes. But I want to ask you about, because you lived in 1970s in Poland, and I want to ask you, could you compare the consumption and the production in the socialist Poland and the capitalist countries? Because I think that there was one thing very important in the socialist country, that the production, the things which was produced in the socialist countries was the things which was hard. They are not when you buy something like I don't know, car or the clothes or things like this. It is something which you can use many years. And in the capitalist countries, when you buy something, the electronic stuff, it is 1 year, 2 year, and you have to buy another and another and another. And I think that, and also we see this pathology in the question of the on the question the bottled water. That in the capitalist countries we have this explosion of the plastic, which all things which you have to buy, the milk, the water, the soda, it is all in the plastic. And in Poland it was different. It was in the glass bottle, which you can
give back.
Yes.
Yes, especially, but you have just to look. If you go to Poland now, or in all former socialist countries, all the trams you are looking at, most of them, I mean, about 90%, I'm sure. I didn't check statistically, but you just look on the street. The tram you are using, the tram car you are using, are all produced during the socialist times. In the some of them are from the 60s even, but basically they are from the 70s, and they are still functioning. If you take the Polish trains, now of course the Polish trains are very destroyed and old-fashioned and so on, but still the wagons you use are wagons that were built at the socialist time, and it's very clear because the Pafawag factory, which was producing wagons in People's Poland, for People's Poland, and also for export, now has closed. So Poland do not produce wagons, but the wagons which are still used were produced at that time, and they are still functioning. They are old now, of course, but they still can be used because they were produced on a quite basic quality. Of course, we can say that at the socialist time, the products were not so cute, so colorful that the capitalist Western ones, but they were much more solid, and even people were joking at that. I remember that when people looked at the Soviet cars, they said, "Oh, gniotsa nie łamiotsa," which means I don't know in English. You try to destroy them, they will never be destroyed. Of course, they were hard, they were tough, they were not very comfortable. But even anti-communists recognized that they couldn't be destroyed. They were indestructible because they were produced to be used, you know, for years, and they're still used for years. I mean, when you look in the Russian Far East now, where you have very tough climatic conditions, what they use there is trucks from the Soviet times, because they produce trucks which are able. You are able to use them with -40 degree, and very hard condition, and they are still used 30, 40 or 50 years after they have been produced. We have also a very good example now. Tractors. The tractors, you had two tractor factories in Soviet Union, one in Russia, one in Belarus. After the collapse of Soviet Union, the Russian factory was closed. But the Belarusian one was not closed because, of course, as you know, Belarusian government didn't went capitalist way. So now the Belarusian tractor factory has the monopoly for the whole former Soviet Union, because in Russia, in Caucasus country, in Central Asia, they still buy Belarusian tractor because they are good. Capitalists destroyed the good production of tractors in Russia, so it opened the entire region for the entire market for Belarusian tractors. So we can say that the success of the tractor industry in Belarus is a socialist success, first from the Soviet times, and second, when independent Belarus decided not to destroy what Soviet Union created. So we have thousands of such examples, and I would say even in Poland or East Germany now, independently from what people think politically, they all say that, almost all people say that, let's say, food was smaczniejszy, was
better taste.
Had a very much easier, much better taste at socialist time. Why? Because it was they used much less chemistry. Even if, as I told you earlier, Khrushchev changed policy, this policy still was not so consequently introduced as in the Western country. When you go in Germany, in Eastern Germany now, you have advertising, capitalist advertising, which use the slogan "Kauf Ossi," which means buy East, because now capitalists discovered that East German food tastes better than West German food. So even the capitalists are recognizing that, of course, to make money, but it's not important in this field. It means they understood that East Germans were accustomed to a relatively tasteful food, and when they discovered Western food, after 2 or 3 months discovering this food, they wanted to go back to East German food, because of course that is sausages produced in DDR are much more ecological than the same so-called same sausages produced in Western Germany. So even if Khrushchev decided that the socialism has to imitate American way of production, the fact that that at that time there was no capitalist competition inside socialist countries made that that there was no, let's say, too extreme measures compared with Western standards, and it explained that except for such islands, I would say, which were under central policy and which were oriented toward a Western, let's say, Western-minded development, the mass of the territory was developing still according to the former pre-Khrushchev time, socialist logics. And it explained why the food in Soviet Union, in Poland, in GDR, and so on was more tasteful than in the West. So we have to take all that into account. Even if the ideology of the Communist Party under Khrushchev changed, the economical logic was still not capitalistic, and there were something that refrained from extreme short-term policies in the field. I remember I was in 1994 in Belarus. And at that time, I visited a countryside, and I met an old peasant. And I talked with him, and he told me about the policy of the agricultural policy of Soviet Union, of Belarus, and so on. And he told me, you know, the grain we are producing in Belarus is much more tasteful than the grain imported from Western country. And he was very aware of the fact that the nature is something vivid, the soil is something vivid, and that you cannot produce good grain if you just produce all the time the same grain on the same land. That there are some different rules in the nature you have to use. He was not religiously ecological, as I told earlier. He was just aware that there is some balance that have to be taken into account. And I would say he was rationally a rational ecologist, not a romantic ecologist like the green middle classes of the West. And he was aware that the Western way of life and of economical life is and the capitalism is bad for the long-term development of agriculture. So, I mean, it was 1994. It was just after the collapse of Soviet Union. And I was very, impressed by the fact that this man, he has not to be taught about ecology by the green and all the let's say green superstructure we have in the Western countries, because he was aware of this question, and the Soviet education gave him that. And then I understood why quite a lot of Eastern Europeans reacted quite quickly against this unecological economy coming from the West. And we can see it. I mean, of course, in Poland now, anti-communism is very strong, ideologically. But if you ask people which food they want to buy, they would prefer to buy food to eat at the bar mleczny than at the restaurant, McDonald's and so on. If you ask them where you would buy your bread, they would say, "Oh, I prefer to buy bread at Spoem," which Spoem is a cooperative which existed from pre-war period, because it's a socialist cooperative, but it existed at the time of the pre-war capitalism, because it was built by socialists, by Polish socialists. So Spoem is a very old Polish socialist left tradition dating back from the beginning of the 20th century. And people say, "Oh, Spoem, the bread at Spoem is better than the bread, at the Lidl or I don't know which Western food." People did understand that. The only problem when you discuss with Poles, they recognize that, and then you have to ask them why agriculture in people's Poland was more tasteful than the nowadays one. Why? Just think about it. It's because of the system. People are not ready to understand it politically, but they understand it for the everyday life, and it's I think it's very important. This has to be taken into account, and I think that the communists should be very aware of that. There is one man in France who is a biologist and who is a communist, and he's living in Lille in the North France, and he wrote a very interesting book about ecology in Soviet Union and Cuba. His name is Guillaume Suing. And of course, I don't know if its book was translated in English. I guess not. But he made quite a huge work as a biologist and as a political militant, showing that communists they don't have to be shy about nature and environment and ecology and economical policies, because quite a lot of time they were in the vanguard of these questions, of these issues, and just that the Western propaganda managed to make people forget about that, and first, and then create this feeling of guilt. People are guilty because nature is destroyed. It's not people who are guilty, it's capitalists who are guilty, because they don't allow to have a system where environmental questions, issues are linked with economical, technical, and human and social progress. Yes. So
okay, I want to say something about. Oh, I am missing myself. So I want to say many things, not many things, but first things which I want to say, it is that in Poland now the two main problems for the quality of the air on Poland. It is because of the heating, and it is because of the transport. And yeah. When we saw the socialist countries, especially Soviet Union, we saw that the transport was public. The best example is the metro of the Moscow.
Yeah.
We can say many things about the metro of the Moscow because it is very, very pretty, very strong, and we can compare this form of transport with, for example, with the airport in Modlin, which was built, and 6 months after it was closed because the quality of the asphalt was bad. But so the transport was public, and the heating also was public, collective heating in all these buildings built in the socialist times. And in the time of the counter-revolution, the propaganda anti-communist said that all these things collective, it is bad, that now we are free, now we can make individual transport, everybody have to buy the car, the old car from Germany, and everybody can build his house, and in his house he is free for heating what he wants. And it is funny that after 20 years of the counter-revolution, I think in the 2010, when the president of the Warsaw was Gronkiewicz-Waltz, the extreme liberal from the platform of the citizen, she recognized that this individual transport in Warsaw, it is something which is madness. she started to ban this. She started to make the road that only for the buses. She started to say that Warsaw people, you have to leave your cars and go to and use this public transport. So we saw this example that the liberal who want to he's the president of the big cities. She understands that only collective solutions, this is solution which work and which is ecological. And now we have this discussion about these heating problems that every time when it is October, November, December in the Polish air, it is the worst air in the Europe. And one of the worst in the world. In Poland, we feel all this smog, and many Polish people are ill for the asthma and things like this. And socialists show that collective solutions are much best for the society, but also for the ecologies.
Yeah, of course, yeah, that's right, and that's a pity that it took too much time to discover that. I wanted also to add something, because of course in the socialist time everything was not perfect. What is normal, because you know, when there is a process of development, you have to first to check things and then to make them better. But what I wanted to say is that from the very beginning of the industrialization of Poland, for example, but it was of course the same thing in all socialist countries, planists were aware of the ecological situation. If you take, for example, the example of Silesia, which is a very industrialized area, which is of course polluted because it's metallurgy and coal, but still we have to take into account that after the Second World War, when the boss of the region was Zientek, who was let's say the regional leader of the region. He was very aware of the situation of the pollution, and he managed to create a complete network of parks and forests inside the city. And especially the very renowned Chorzów Park of Culture and culture, wypoczynku, and rest, to have culture and rest. But if you go in Silesia, you see quite a lot of forest, and especially when you have some plant. Around plants, you have always forest, and of course, the error was that at that time they didn't realize that pollution was so strong that forest will not be sufficient to limit pollution. But still, if you compare Silesia with, let's say, Ruhrgebiet in Germany or northern France coal area in the north and in Belgium after the Second World War, the Polish Silesia was much more green and much less polluted than at that time the Ruhrgebiet and the northern French mining areas. Of course, they discovered after that it was not sufficient, but it's important to still to be aware that they were aware that from the very beginning about this issue. Of course, they took partly right decision, but insufficient decision. But still, they took decision in 1948, 49, 50, 51, and so on and so on. They took a decision in that direction. And of course, that in the Western countries were also very polluted in the 40s, 50s, 60s. They began to think about ecology much later than a socialist country. But of course, they were richer, so they could invest in ecology. So now we have the impression they are in the vanguard of humankind for ecology. But in fact, they are not in the vanguard of humankind for the ecology. Socialist countries were in the vanguard, and Western countries are not so polluted because they exported their pollution in the southern country. All polluting industry belonging to Western big firms were exported in third world countries where they produce massively. So when we look now, let's say at Germany or France or England, and we say, oh, London is clean. Of course, London is clean. But because Karachi and Bombay and Lagos and Rio de Janeiro is completely dirty because of Western companies. And we have to think to take that into account. Capitalists just exported its pollution in third world countries. It didn't solve the pollution problem. Socialist country never exported their pollution. The pollution was, let's say, equally distributed. There was no colonial, let's say, colonial development. It was a development equal for everybody. So even the bad things were equally distributed. Western imperialists, they distribute bad things to other countries, and they have the good ones for themselves. So of course there is less pollution in this situation. So we have also to take that into account. But I will remind also a slogan which was very important in the Soviet Union in the 30s and 40s. The slogan was that every peasant must become the agronome of his soil. So a peasant is not only exploiting land, but he has to be scientifically aware of what is life, what is soil, what is nature, what is the balance. And it's also very important because when we look at peasant now in capitalist country, you ask peasant in France or wherever, they are completely depressed. They are depressed for economical reason, but they are also depressed for ecological reason. I mean, I will take the example of France. In France, statistically, there is one peasant who is committing suicide every 2 days. That's the situation of France for the last 10 years. Average French peasant, every 2 days there is one peasant who is committing suicide. So it's not for individual reason. It's for economical, social, and ecological reason. And if you talk with French peasants, why they are so depressed, why they have nervous breakdown, why they have burnout, and so on. Of course, partly because of economical situation, which is linked with capitalist concentration process, making poor peasants less and less competitive with richer peasants, but it's not the only reason. The second reason is that they have no choice to produce what they want. They have to produce what, concretely in France, what the European Commission plan for them to produce. And not only they have to produce what the European Commission decide, but they have also to buy a grain, to buy a species. A European Commission has decided which one they have to buy. So, I mean, they are completely, the so-called capitalistic agriculture has the worst aspect of the old feudal agriculture, with the technicity of capitalism, which is polluting land with chemical products. So we have the worst of capitalism now mixed with the worst of feudalism. And in this situation, peasants are, they have no autonomy. They have not at all autonomy. And I remember in the 90s, I had a delegation of Russian peasants coming in France, or in Western Europe, actually. And one of my friends was working at the Brussels Commission, and she was rather ecological oriented. And she told me that as a European functionary, she had to show Russian peasants all the good aspect of European integration, European agriculture, and so on and so on. So she did the job, but she called me and she told me, Bruno, just come to this peasant, because I would like you to make them debriefing, because I can not tell them what is going on here in Europe, because it's my employer. But you are free, so just come and tell them what's bad in Europe. Okay, so I went there and I began to ask. I even didn't make a course. I just began my lecture, so-called, asking those peasants what they thought, what they think about what they saw in France and everywhere. And I was fearing, actually, that they would say, oh, Western countries are so developed and in Russia we're so bad, so backward, and so on. But it was not the case. That was very funny, because I asked them, and first nobody did answer. And at the end, there was some peasant at the rear of the lounge. He stand up. And then he began to tell, what you are doing here in European Union is the success story our party leader from Khrushchev time wanted to make in Soviet Union. But you realized it. In Soviet Union, fortunately, we didn't, because when there were stupid orders coming from Moscow, our kolkhoz directors were not so stupid. And they managed always to make a compromise, because between those bureaucrats in Moscow and the reality of the production in our land. So congratulations for the European Union. What Khrushchev wanted to do, you did, and we didn't. And then I understood they were much more clever. I mean, they were conscious. They were educated people. They were peasants, but still they were, of course, educated people. They were not 19th century peasants. They were 20th century peasants. So they had, let's say, the old peasant mentality, but they had also the scientific way of thinking, because they had school and so on. So they understood, in fact. At that time, I was not aware that, about the Khrushchev policy I told you about earlier. But now I understood when I wrote, when I read that, that in fact, Soviet peasants were resisting to the so-called modernity coming from Moscow during the Khrushchev times. And they were much more, let's say, Stalin biological agriculture oriented than the Khrushchev American agricultural policy oriented. And now I confronted this very practical experience with the theory I read later about it. And in fact, I understand that if Soviet agriculture did not completely bankrupt, it's because the masses of peasants did resist to the Americanization of their agriculture. And when I'm talking about the mass of peasants, of course, it includes most directors of kolkhozs and sovkhozs who were much more linked with their own reality than with the bureaucrats in Moscow that were looking at Californian and Kansas agriculture because it was supposed to be very, very progressive. And it was not. Now we know that. So it's interesting because it shows how even on the ecological field, there was something in Soviet Union like a class struggle between the popular masses, which were aware of the reality, and the bureaucrats, which were looking into the United States, fascinated with United States and American way of life and American culture and American efficiency and so on on the agricultural field and other fields. So, I mean, what we called in Marxism revisionism was a very strong reality and a vivid reality. There was always fight between the revisionism and the Marxist line. And even if it was not theoretized, but when this Russian peasant told me what he told me, in fact, he was not aware that he was going along the Marxist line, but he was going along the Marxist line against the revisionist one. He didn't understood theoretically what he was fighting for, but he practically he was carrying on this. So that's why after having observed all the so-called success of the European Union agriculture, he was not impressed. He was just looking at that like something very bad. So he was class conscious, I would say. And that's that's for me a very, very, very good moment of my life when I talked with those peasants. They were so, so realistic, so clever, so conscious, and I thought that everything is not lost.
So I want to add to the people who are not who don't know Poland that after Second World War, the Warsaw was the most green capital in Europe. It is because all Warsaw was destroyed in the time of the war, and after when the communists started to rebuild the Warsaw, they planned many green areas. So in the center of the Warsaw, we can find the place of the petite agriculture activity that that people who lived in Warsaw can go there. They have petty square of the land, and they can make them tomatoes or apples or stuff like this. And we have also the park. For example, in the biggest building in the Warsaw, it is the Palace Culture and the Science, and it was surrounded by the big green areas. And also we have forest in the Warsaw. So it was very, very green. And the first things which was made after the Contra-Revolution, it is war against these green areas. So, for example, in the district where I was living, there was this green places with the agriculture. All the time they try to destroy something, to build the new shopping mall or stuff like this. All these green areas surrounded in the Palace of the Culture and the Science. In 1990s, it was occupied by the traders who sell something. And in the example of Warsaw, what Warsaw was in the 1980s, it was green, ecologic cities, and in the 90s it started to be the crowded cities when the green areas was destroyed. And now I see in the Paris that Madame Hidalgo, they try to build something which was in Warsaw in 1950s, that build the green areas in the center of the capital. But it is, and she said that she is ecologic and it is modern. No, it is not modern. It is copy the planific urbanization which was made in the socialist countries.
But I think she's not aware about that, because she has not the cultural levels to understand that she's not just copying something that was already done. I'm quite sure she doesn't know about that. And I would add to what you say something very important, because after the collapse of Soviet Union, there was, because in Soviet Union, it was very hard times at that time, because the economical situation was very, very bad. And quite a lot of people did starve or were near to starve. And if Russian, Ukrainian, Belarusian, Kazakhs, Georgian, and so on, living in the cities didn't die of starvation, mostly it's because most of them had this little green areas where they could go in the weekend to grow potatoes, grow something, basically that allowed them to survive in a situation where even if they were still employed, they didn't receive salary, because for 3 or 5 years, depending on the situation, most workers, most employees in former Soviet Union didn't receive their salaries. Or received it very irregularly, and even when they received, the money was insufficient due to inflation. So they were in a very, very bad situation, but they did survive because of this former Soviet policies to give people a small amount of land, even for city people, so they at least they can be self-sufficient for themselves and their family. and collectivization was for the general production. But for family production, the people had these little plants and this little land, and it was a complete culture. It is a culture there. You know, you go to the weekend and you work there a little bit, and you eat, and you have family discussion, and you invite friends, and you know, you are in the city, but still you're not in the city. You're in the countryside and in the city in the same time, and it's something very you know, very you cannot imagine that in Western countries, where the countryside is far from the city, and you know, you have countryside people and people.
Bruno, I was living 3 months in the department in Saint-Denis. It's a small ville. It's named the Montmagny, and there was a place like this. And there was it was written that it was created by the Communist Party of the France in 1950s, and it was I was there 5 years ago, and it is like in Warsaw.
Yeah, but the difference is that it's an exception in the Western world, a good exception, but still an exception. And in Eastern countries, it was the rule. I mean, everywhere, in Czechoslovakia, in Germany, in Poland, in Soviet Union, in Belarus, everywhere. And it's very important for the agricultural point of view, but it's also very important for a psychological point of view. Because it changed the minds. I mean, people who have contact with you know, with production. You know, you are a university teacher, but in the weekend you go and you plant potatoes. It makes you look at the world in a different way. Because you have contact with production, you have contact with, you know, with the reality, and in a certain sense it's very Marxist, because it makes out of you, partly at least, a peasant, and not only, you know, an intellectual which is talking about ecology, but you know, the real ecology, you have to have your hand in the land from time to time if you want to be real ecologist.
Okay, I have to finish because my wife want to use bathroom. But in the end, I want to say something, that in Poland now, when somebody wants to go to the weekend, for example, in the mountains or in the lakes, Missouri, all the time is the same story, that Friday evening the streets are crowded to go there. Yeah. So they want to rest in the nature, but for this they need to be in this car, in this crowded situation. And in socialist Poland, you go 5 minutes by walk and you are in the green area.
That's it. Yeah. No, anyway, so I think that it's a very important, a huge field of thinking we have to take into account, and to think about what socialism did already realize, and it gives us, of course, perspective for the future.
Okay, thank you, Bruno. We don't finish this big subject, but I think that is good start to try to introduce this socialist ecology for other leftists who don't know this.
Yeah, of course.
Okay, thanks.